Good afternoon. Let's begin. I'm Scott Sagan, professor of political science and co-director here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this seminar, and especially to welcome Alex Debs back to CSAC and back to Stanford. Alex is the associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Yale. He's also a faculty director of the Nuclear Security Program at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. He's written widely on questions of the causes of war, the conduct of war, and nuclear politics. He's the author or co-author with Nuno Monteiro of Nuclear Politics, the Strategic Causes of Proliferation. And since June 2024, he's been serving as the associate editor of the American Political Science Review. So be careful when you talk to him, because he's going to ask you to be a outside reviewer for different articles that may be coming out or may be rejected by that journal, because they reject a lot of articles. I said welcome back because Alex was a Stanton postdoctoral fellow here, and it is great to have him come back. We'll be following the normal Thursday afternoon sessions where people should try to get my attention to if they want to ask a question or make a comment. If you want to jump the queue, put up 2 fingers, and I'll try to let people make second comment on the comment directly related. And I'll also then stop occasionally and take Q&A from people in the online. So please, for those of you online, put your question into the Q&A or the chat, and I'll try to call on you going back and forth between the room and the online audience. So please join me in welcoming Alex Debs.
Thank you so much. It's really terrific to be back here. I have such fond memories of my time here in 2011, 2012. I arrive on campus and CSAC is putting together a party, a retirement party for Scott Sagan as he was stepping down from his role as co-director of CSAC. There's all this hand-wringing about whether the United States is the indispensable nation. I think we can agree Scott is the indispensable academic. And I've benefited so much from his mentoring and advice. The conference itself brought in academics, students, advisees who came in and presented ideas, and in cases disagreed with him. And it really showed the spirit in the community that Scott has nurtured to have such conversations. This project is on what was the bread and butter of CSAC before it changed from the Center of International Security and Arms Control to the Center of International Security and Cooperation. This is a project on arms control that I think we should think about some more. It's joint with Matthew Fuhrmann, who is visiting Yale. Who may be seeing us online, who helped us on this project: Nicole Chen, Avi Ross, Will Shaw, Brian Shim, and Jiron Leon for all their great work. So this project is on strategic stability between the United States and China in historical perspective. And the question we're interested in, get the clicker to go. This was working earlier. Can you help me add the screen? Sorry, can you help me? We did try it earlier. So it's this one here, right? Down, okay, down, okay. What are the prospects for arms control agreements between the United States and China? China has not only been growing economically, but also militarily, and we're working up in the last 5 years with the expansion of its nuclear arsenal, revelations in early 2021 of the big missile fields that they were, missile silos that they were building. Is there hope for arms control agreements between these two states? And I think it's fair to say that there's not much optimism on this one. firing over here. And we're thinking that the harder problem in the past, because we're looking at rivalries between the United States and China, but also Russia potentially may be a more difficult scenario than which to reach arms control agreements. I think these concerns are theoretically valid and potentially very powerful. What we're wondering in trying to assess them is that it's hard to know what is the empirical basis under which we can evaluate the extent to which they make sense of patterns of arms control. Great power competition, well, there was some before the Cold War architecture was agreed upon between the US and the Soviet Union. Multiple rivalries, well, there were multiple rivalries in the interwar period in particular, which did generate the Washington and London naval treaties. We would have been very happy to just take a data set off the shelf and provide some summary statistics, but as we thought about this problem, we realized that additional work needed to be done in creating that data set. And so what I'm going to do today is a bit of a bait and switch in that I'm going to tell you about a data set about the past. And I'm going to spend a lot of time about the past. I know there's a lot of expertise in this room on the current strategic situation. And what I'm going to try to do is give you a sense of these patterns and how we think about arms control agreements, the conditions for these agreements, and then just expand upon what would be the implications for the current day. And I very much look forward to your feedback on that front. So what we did in the last close to 2 years now is build a data set of arms control agreements looking over the last 2 centuries. We've identified close to 300 agreements that fit our definition, which I'll introduce to you in a minute. And we're reflecting also on the conditions under which great powers could agree to limit their military capabilities. And just in short, the type of agreement, and I'll define that a little bit more soon, that the US and Russia may agree upon happen under relatively rare circumstances. What is difficult harkens back to some of the issues I mentioned earlier, is that if we think about arriving at an agreement, this may solidify the balance of power at relatively lower cost, right? So the alternative to an arms control agreement might be arms racing, which could take powers in the same final point, but at much greater expense. Solidifying the balance of power has the benefit of saving on the costs of peace. But if we are facing complex rivalry structures, the parties may have a hard time coming to an agreement. So if I am in a rivalry with Scott and with Jim, but Scott is not in a rivalry with Jim, Scott is in a rivalry with Ori, maybe I agree with Scott, but then I'm going to worry about my vulnerabilities vis-a-vis Jim, and Scott is going to worry about his vulnerability relative to Ori. So adding these complexity, it's a hypothetical scenario. Adding these complexities makes it hard for us to find an agreement if there's not much overlap in rivalry preferences. And then what you would want to as well is relative similarities in capabilities, so that if one side breaks out and defects from the agreement, the other could respond relatively easily. If there's more asymmetry, the weaker party may feel very vulnerable and may not come to an agreement. So there's going to be externalities, transaction costs, and worries about defections. And so that's what I'm going to be reflecting on in the course of this paper and this project. Coming to implications for the current day, I guess you could say, yes, let's be gloomy about the very short term, in that we're looking at relatively complex rivalry structures, the US being rival with Russia and China. That's more complex than just US versus Soviet Union. And disparity in capabilities, with China building its nuclear arsenal, but nowhere near the nuclear arsenal of the US and Russia. So maybe there could come to some agreements. Maybe they would be information sharing agreements to try to reduce the risk of accidents. Maybe they'll agree on issues of common concern, say in regulating the outer space. In the medium term, and this may be a more controversial statement, maybe what we would see both on capabilities and preferences, as China is building its nuclear arsenal, it may get to a point where it feels confident enough, and there would be an agreement once we reach that point. Looking at China, I think in recent estimates, potentially reaching 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. Once we get to this point, that might be a point where there would still be hope for arms control agreements. And the most controversial one, if we see the US trying to improve relations with Russia in this hypothetical scenario where those relations are better and there's less conflicts of interest, and those are big ifs, on that very narrow scenario, this would be a less complex rivalry structure that might be more amenable to arms control agreements between the great powers. Now, I just want to clarify, this is a very narrow claim. There's other bad consequences that would come along with it, and we're already seeing them in terms of concerns for proliferation, as our allies in Europe are worrying about the reliability of US assurances, but I wanted to throw it out there as a point for conversation. I very much look forward to your feedback here. So what I'm going to do now is introduce to you the data set, what we see in the historical cases, why our data set produces these cases, how it differs from what we could find in the literature, think about a theory for the conditions for arms control agreements, and some case studies that would illustrate the conditions under which agreements are possible, and then come back to the US-China security dialogue. Again, most of the talk will be on these first 2 points, which is where I think our competitive advantage is greatest in the investment we've made in this longer view. And then I'm very interested in your thoughts on these, certainly, and on the current moment as well. So what is an arms control agreement? It's any agreement between at least 2 states that would limit either the development or possession, deployment, or blanket use of military capabilities. Okay, so this is trying to solidify the balance of power, the military capabilities, either preventing states from developing them, deploying them on certain territories, or blanketly using them against each other or against other states. So this would be trying to solidify the balance of power at low costs. Again, we may end up in an arms race that takes us to the same point, but we've expended all these resources trying to get there and gain an advantage or protect ourselves against another state. What would be other possible advantages? Just taking as a metaphor the role of elections in democracy and a state deciding not to hold them as crossing a red line that would go in a non-democratic direction. If you agree not to develop a capability and you do develop it, then this would be crossing a line that's brighter than if there's no real discussion or agreement over the meaning of certain actions. Maybe arms control agreements can lead states to channel competition in areas of advantage. This is an argument that Brendan Green has made in his recent book. But it's hard to know if you could have this mutual optimism on both sides, trying to think we each get something out of the deal where we're channeling competition, each of us, in areas of agreement. So we're really focusing on this first benefit here, and that's going to help us think about when you can get this agreement between different parties. What is that going to exclude? What is that going to include? And how does that going to differ make our data set different from existing data sets in the literature? So first, we won't have single state declarations. So something like the Lieber Code is not going to be entering our data set as an arms control agreement. Agreement on principles. So saying that we should work towards a work towards a world without nuclear weapons. If it's not saying we can't acquire nuclear weapons, that's an agreement on principles. Law of war, we should make genocide a crime. Well, this is talking about how you would conduct conflict, but not necessarily developing or blanketly using capabilities. Amending an existing agreement, sharing information about where your capabilities are, trading technology that could be used for dual use, but limiting its use for peaceful purposes. So those are things we pick up in the process of creating that data set, but we're going to set them aside as different from what we have in mind as arms control agreements. What it will include, which is not necessarily in all the data sets, first, demilitarized zone agreements. So if we have 2 states that say, for example, South Korea and North Korea, that say, here's this band of territory where we don't deploy military capabilities, that will be, for us, a limit on military capabilities. The other will be neutrality agreement, and this may be more controversial. Let me explain what I have in mind. And then, again, we single those out, and so if we want to have a study excluding them, we can conduct that too. So think about 2 states agreeing not to deploy certain capabilities on their territory. This is in a world in which states have sovereign rights over what they do on their territory. and are in charge of their own defense. They could also enter in an alliance where the allies deploy military capabilities on their territory. So one thing that happens in neutrality agreements, and we'll read the text to see if that's specifically something that's decided upon and agreed upon by the parties, is a commitment not to let your territory be used for attacks against the other state. That would be a limit on what third parties could do in deploying their capabilities on your territory or using it to prepare for attacks against another state. So that will be something we'll pick up as well. So again, for robustness, we may exclude them if we don't like this. So here's sort of some comparison with some data sets. And I'll use data sets in quotation marks in the sense that some of these sources are books that don't really have lists and covariates of these agreements. They mention some agreements. So the first column is our data set. We cover 200 years, produced 298 agreements. Here I'm listing what we include and then what we exclude. Given this coverage, it will include, for example, the Rush-Bagot Agreement on the non-militarization of the Great Lakes between Canada, between British North America and the US, the St. Petersburg Declaration, the Brussels Conference Act, where European states agree not to sell weapons to African subjects, the 1919 Versailles Treaty, where Germany is forced not to militarize a part of its territory, the Korean War Armistice, which establishes a demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, the Israel-Jordan Treaty, where they both agree that their territory won't be used for attacks against the other, the Convention on Cluster Munitions of 2008. So those are agreements and types of agreements that we include and capture in our data set. What we don't capture, the Genocide Convention, we see this more as sort of principles or law of war agreement. The 18-Nation Disarmament Committee, that's just a hope for further work. We'll capture the NPT, but the AENDC in and of itself, we don't see it as an arms control agreement. And the ASAT negotiations, which actually don't produce an agreement, which are failed negotiations. So I'm going to show you 4 other data sets we considered and engaged with and decided we better construct our own. First is a book by Joseph Goldblatt, which is very good and covers the 1868 to 2002 period. It's got a lot of data sets. It's going to miss, it's going to include some. It's going to miss some of the earlier data sets. It will include the Genocide Convention, which we think isn't strictly speaking arms control agreements. It will miss some earlier agreements, the Rush-Bagot Agreement, and miss some later agreements like the Convention on Cluster Munitions, but also won't include the neutrality agreements, which we think are consistent with the concept. CREPS 2018 has a data set between 1945 and 2010 that's specifically looking at nuclear arms control agreements. And so it's going to miss a lot of the agreements that we're interested in because they're not about nuclear arms control. 2 other data sets. One is by Weinmann and Volpe, this excellent international organization paper covering the 1899 to 2015 period. It's going to include DMZ type of agreements, but it will also include what we see as not really arms control agreements like the ENDC or the ASAT, which did not produce an agreement. And again, here, this is the best we could make from the article. Again, this wasn't specifically a list that was produced by them, but they mentioned various agreements in their process of understanding which technologies are being limited. It's also going to miss some agreements that fall outside of their area of interest. It's also going to miss the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions. It's a relatively small data set compared to what we have. We've also been in touch with some colleagues at Uppsala who are in the process of creating a data set. And so this may be in flux, but they include many, including amendments of existing agreements. They'll include the Genocide Convention, which we don't think should be in there. And they'll miss, the Korean War Armistice and other agreements that we think should be included. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of the due diligence we did. We would have happy to take it off the shelf, but we felt like we needed to create our own. So first, I'm just going to give you some summary statistics of what we see. and then try to build towards an understanding of when they're being produced. This first figure is giving you the year on the x-axis and the number of agreements on the y-axis. And the data points are just average over decades. And what you see is that from this, you might have guessed, before you saw this, you might have guessed maybe the Cold War is this golden era of arms control agreements. I mean, there are some in the Cold War, but there's also many in the post-Cold War. And in fact, there are other agreements in the interwar period, some of which are resulting from the Great Shock of the Great War. And for example, the Versailles Treaty, but others that are regulating behavior between European states. This is all arms control agreements. Then what we want to do, because we're ultimately interested in arms control agreements between the US and China, which would limit each other's capabilities. First, we're going to just restrict attention to major power arms control agreements, where at least one of the parties is a major power. And you see that so here in the previous period, the interwar doesn't look that good, and the post-Cold War very much stands out. It evens out a little bit once you restrict attention to major powers. So the peak in the sort of end of history moment is not as strong relative to the interwar and the Cold War period. The other element that you want to think about is that when I showed you this list of the types of agreements that are being concluded, some of them look very different from each other. And before we start to explain this, it would make sense to disaggregate them. And those three types of agreement that occur to us as we're looking to see what is being agreed upon, one would be symmetric agreement. So what would we mean by that? We could have an agreement between two parties where each agrees to limit its capabilities. Not that they agree to the exact same limits on their capabilities, but the restrictions are on all the parties to the treaty. So this we call symmetric agreements. That's one type. You can think of the Korean War armistice establishing the DMZ agreement as one of those. Another would be agreed asymmetric agreements, where there's an agreement between two parties, but the limits are only on one of them. And the 1919 Versailles Treaty would be one of those. For example, France and Britain telling Germany the piece of territory where they can't deploy military capabilities. And the third one would be what we call imposed asymmetric, where we would agree that a state that's not party to the treaty will not be able to access a technology. So for example, COCOM would be of that sort, okay? Really what we're interested in are symmetric agreements, and these other agreements may follow different logics, and we should better separate them out before we try to explain when symmetric agreements arise. And this isn't a purely theoretical exercise. In that data set that I just showed you, it's relatively evenly divided between these three types. So I'm showing you symmetric in blue, agreed asymmetric in red, and imposed asymmetric in green. And this is the number of agreements where there's some major power as one of the parties. And symmetric are maybe a third of these agreements between great powers. Once you focus your attention to symmetric agreements between major powers, this is the pattern that we see, that there aren't that many agreements up until the sort of mid-Cold War period. There are some in the interwar period. Then we have some during the Cold War, and then still the biggest peak is in the end of history, or sort of late 90s to 2000s period. So this is what we're trying to understand. These would be the comparison cases for an agreement between the US and China, or US, China, Russia on capabilities. And what we're going to say is that whether there are agreements of that sort depends on preferences and capabilities. How complicated are the preferences are? Do we have overlapping rivalry structures, or are they very complex where A and B want to limit their own capabilities, but A worries about C and B worries about D, et cetera? And then how diverse the capabilities are between the parties, which will tell us whether they could respond to one of the parties reneging to the agreement. So here is the summary of our theory about when we expect different types. And ultimately, what we're interested in are the symmetric agreements. So first, we're going to say are we looking at a post-war period or a peacetime period? If we're looking at a post-war period, was the outcome of the war decisive or not? These agreed asymmetric agreements, where the parties agree to limitations, but they're restricted to one of the parties, we expect them after a decisive war. So think about World War I, where Germany is defeated, it has to sign on to agreement. The Allies may say, well, we want to solidify the balance of power with Germany being at a disadvantage and Germany being defeated, signs on to the agreement. So that would be one outcome. Another would be, if it's not decisive, think of the Korean War. Well, they jointly agree to have a demilitarized zone where they won't deploy military capabilities on a band of territory. Then when we look at peacetime, so we're interested in symmetric agreements in peacetime, it will depend on whether we have broadly similar, and I'll explain to you what I mean by broadly similar preferences, rivalry preferences between the great powers, and broadly similar capabilities or not. So one example of broadly similar capabilities and preferences would be the interim agreement of 1972 between the US and the Soviet Union. When we have dissimilar preferences or capabilities, we think it's unlikely that we'll see similar agreements, but we might see a subset of states agreeing between each other to leave out other parties. So for example, COCOM would be an example of that, where Western states agree, let's shut out the communist states from accessing certain capabilities. So here I'm just giving you some summary statistics in the years where we see these measures, and I've emboldened the type of agreement that we think would be most likely and the percentage of these agreements that fall in that category. So in the decisive outcome, we expected agreed asymmetric, where the defeated state accepts limits on its power. That is the most common agreement. Non-decisive war, and the decisiveness here is based on a writer data set. There's only two, and the Korean War is one of them. The other being, according to that quoting, the Vietnam War. I don't know if I would qualify that as a non-decisive outcome, but that's what the data set says. It might be more clearly seen as a more decisive defeat by the US, and in that case, we would expect it to be agreed asymmetric. When we have broadly similar capabilities and preferences, we expect symmetric, and this is the majority of these agreements in these scenarios. And when they're dissimilar, we expect imposed asymmetric, and that's what we find to be most common, okay? So here, what I want to do is just talk a little bit more about what we mean by broadly similar preferences and capabilities, going back to the trends that I showed you earlier. Think of, for example, rivalry structures before World War II, and compare that to rivalry structures in 1970. And here you have states, and they have arrows between them if they're coded as having a rivalry. So you have Germany basically having a rivalry with most states in the system, Italy having rivalries with France and the UK, and et cetera. Compare that to the scenario of 1970, where you have these great powers, US, China, Soviet Union. This is a simpler rivalry structure on the right in 1970 than it was before World War II. The specific measure that I'm going to show you is called the Hamming distance, which is common in computer science, not so much in political science. Typically, when we think about similar preferences, we usually look at positive relationships, friends of friends, or treaty allies, or treaty trade partners. But here, what we're going to do is code it as a 1. So write a table, have states in the rows and the columns, and write it as a 1 if there's a rivalry between the two states, and a 0 if there isn't. And we're going to calculate the average distance between these vectors in different periods. So that's going to give us our Hamming distance. And the greater is the average distance, the less overlap there is in the preferences between the different states. And that's what we're going to see here. So here we have in blue the symmetric agreements between major powers. In red, what we have is this Hamming distance between the great powers. And what we're thinking is, if that distance is high, it should be hard to have an agreement, because the parties would worry about externalities created with other states. Bringing in other states may be difficult to come to an agreement. And basically what we see here is that it relatively captures well the dynamics leading up to 1950, in that you have high distance, which decreases in the interwar period, and there's a slight increase in the number of great power symmetric agreements. And then similarly, we see the Hamming distance going down during the Cold War, the number of agreements going up, and in the last period, distance going up and the number of agreements going down. So this negative relationship, broadly speaking, we do see in the data. The second element we're going to think about is the distribution of capabilities. And here, all we're going to do is calculate a Gini coefficient in the capabilities of the great powers. And again, I'm showing you on the x-axis, so the x-axis is the year. On the y-axis, we have counts. In the blue, we have symmetric agreement. In red, we have Gini coefficient of military capabilities between great powers. Not much predictive power before 1950, but we see that as the concentration of military capabilities goes down during the Cold War, the number of agreements goes up. And if we move forward in the more recent period, the Gini coefficient goes up and the number of agreements goes down. So these are just broadly summary statistics, but I think they fit with what we would have anticipated theoretically. And what I want to do in this last survey of the data before we come back to implications for the US and China is give you perspectives on changes in capabilities and changes in preferences. So let's think about the US-Soviet Union rivalry. In the early Cold War, there are asymmetric capabilities, and in fact, a lot of nuclear superiority speak within the US, that it matters to have more nukes than the Soviets, and you get coercive leverage from it. Well, guess what? The Soviets won't come to an agreement to limit their capabilities until their capabilities have increased and the asymmetry of capabilities has been reduced. So what you see as agreements would be agreements between subsets of states like COCOM, leaving out the communist states, or you see information sharing agreements to try to limit the risk of accidents, but those aren't necessarily limiting military capabilities. And here we would venture to say it's not clear that there's an internal logic that signing some of these information agreements leads to confidence building and later agreements. What we think we see as more of a causal factor is as you have more symmetry between the capabilities, the Soviets come to the table and they agree with the 72 interim agreement and later the 87 INF treaty. Also coercing minor powers in the NPT not to acquire nuclear weapons. So that's on the side of capabilities. On the side of preferences, we see that same dynamic if you go from the 19th century to the interwar period. In the 19th century, we saw a large heterogeneity of preferences and low probability of agreements. Some of the agreements we see are like the Brussels Conference Act, where we have a subset of states agreeing not to sell weapons to outsiders, like Africans, sort of to say, we all can agree on this common goal. Selling weapons to them means they shoot at us. Let's agree not to trade them these capabilities. And what we see as the difference in rivalry structure goes down, there are some agreements in still relatively complex scenarios relative to the Cold War, but less complex than they had been in the 19th century when great powers agreed to limits on their naval capabilities. So that is essentially what I wanted to say. And just to remind you, this was a deep dive into history and what we can see from patterns. What we're concerned about are symmetric agreements in peacetime between the US, China, potentially US, China, Russia. Let's look back to see when they happen, what share of the total set of agreements they are, the circumstances under which they arise. And we think these are relatively rare because you're going to need some similarity of capabilities so that parties can respond to the other side's defection, or some similarity of preferences so it's not an overwhelming problem to have agreement between the parties at the table and they don't worry about externalities and vulnerabilities relative to other states. Turning to the US-China, again, just a reminder of what we think this could provide as an interesting starting point and reflection point. Yes, there might be little prospect for arms control. And maybe where we would see them would be in information sharing or in issues of common agreement. But in terms of limiting their own capabilities as symmetric agreements, that might have to wait a reduction in the asymmetry of capabilities. And who knows, perhaps US efforts to sort of simplify, if it can create this reality, might increase the prospects for arms control. Like a scenario of US-China is a less difficult problem to solve than trying to have this three-body problem with multiple rivalries between different states. That's what I wanted to say. Yes.
I'm going to ask one question and then go around the room and people can raise hands. One thing I'd be curious, I didn't see the whole data set, obviously, but there are some, what I would call an arms control agreement that don't control arms in terms of numbers, but in terms of operations, like the dangerous military agreement, dangerous military activities agreement between Russia and the US towards the end of the Cold War, saying, you know, don't point lasers, or if you have a plane that accidentally flies into our airspace, here's the code to coordinate so you don't shoot down airliners, etc. Is that included? Because to me, I would think that that's another area where it might be possible. It certainly would be helpful, but it might be possible to get US-China. But I don't know if that particular area comes out.
Yes, so I think so. I think the laser, the agreement you're referring to, is caught in our data set as sort of an agreement on limiting the use of that technology.
Okay.
So I think that would fall under that category.
And what category would that be then? It's bilateral.
If it's an agreement between the two sides and it only limits their use of that technology, that would be symmetric.
Patrick first, and then the gentleman here. So Patrick, and if you could introduce yourself and say a word about what you do for the rest of the audience, that'd be great.
Perfect. Is there a microphone? Or
they're right in front of you, right there.
Oh, here we go. Oh, just leave it. I'm not going to touch anything. Patrick, I'm a Stanton Fellow this year at CSAC, and we're kind of on U.S. domestic politics and use of force. So a question I had on this is, and I'm definitely not deep in this current debate on how China is affecting the prospects for arms control, but my understanding is one of the big problems is not just that there's a third player, but the third player and the second player, i.e. China and Russia, are not formally allied, but closely partnered. And so you sometimes hear this, that kind of strategic planners in the US are worried about essentially having to deter two at once. And somehow we have to have enough weapons to have each one of ours aimed at one of their silos. So we have to build more. That's going to make them build more. How does that close alignment between two of the players affect this, I guess, is the story.
Yeah, so, I mean, one way to think about this would be, so the measure of the complexity of preferences that we've talked about, what it would capture would be more complexity in the preferences in this current scenario, with the US rival with Russia and China not rival with each other, than if Russia is not a rival with either. So let's say this gambit works and the US says, fine, we're friendly with Putin. That's it. We have good relations with them. We've created this reality where we don't worry about engaging in security. Now, this may be a fanciful world, because maybe reality brings you back to the moment. That is a simpler problem to go away from directly between the US and China, which would be an easier problem to solve than to try and
also, because historically, when you look at that relationship, Russia/Soviet, usually what happens is when the parties make peace, then then the other two are conflict. So I think about how when the U.S. and China solve things, and all of a sudden the Chinese and the Russians were at it. So I guess I wonder that in your hypothesis here, if we make peace with the Russians, I feel like the Chinese and the Russians are just going to turn and look at each other and start pointing missiles at each other again. So does that really fundamentally change the dynamic that would make some kind of arms control more feasible?
I mean, that's interesting, and that's a good question. I mean, in the arc of the Cold War, what you see is a movement from an alliance between the Soviet Union and China, and then a flipping with the normalization of relations in the 1969 and the conflict between the Soviet Union and China. I mean, here the sort of trite conclusion would be to say, solve your political problems, you'll be able to solve your hardware problem. I think you're pointing at dynamics and realities bringing back the powers and bringing to the surface rivalries that they may have if some are being solved. This is something interesting and important to think about. What I meant earlier was that it wasn't clear that it makes it simpler as it changes who people are rivals with. If it doesn't make it simpler, it may not lead to more arms control. But if it does lead to overall improvement in relations with some great powers, it should make it easier for some of them to come to an agreement. Yeah.
Great. I just want to encourage the guests from the NDU to feel free to jump in and ask questions. I've got you on the list. Wook, and then Anna, and then we'll come to you.
Thanks, Alex. I have two questions.
Introduce yourself for
sorry.
everybody else in the audience.
My name is Chang-Wook Ju. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. And I have two questions, one on the data structure, the second on, I want to kind of probe your thoughts on, some substantive questions. But to start, so it seems the data set kind of demarcates the peacetime and post-war, but I think a lot of agreements may be happening during crisis, and then crisis cannot be maybe purely wartime or peacetime.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how you kind of dealt with that conceptual boundaries. And also, for example, Korea is still at war, but it was based on the armistice, and it cannot be like maybe post-war, but does the conceptual clarity might be appreciated. And the second question is as a broad stroke implication, how did the nuclear revolution and weapons of mass destruction affect the overall trend of this the number of arms control agreements, and how is military innovation currently affecting that? And also in the future, how will AI integration into military capabilities affect those arms agreement controls and arms control agreements and also crisis management? I just want to probe your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So on the war versus crisis, one post-crisis arms control agreement, which is an agreed asymmetric agreement that just jumped at us early on as we were doing this research, is the Algeciras treaty, including Morocco after the Moroccan crisis, which limit Morocco's ability to import arms on its territory. So we thought, let's include the post-crises in the same way that we would include the post-war agreements. We found, we're still grappling with this. I think theoretically, we see some similarities between the post-crises and the post-war. One big difference is that the post-war happens after a big shock in the balance of power. Right? So the two, the sides are involved in military conflict. One of them is defeated if it's a decisive outcome and has significantly less military capabilities. The victors want to impose an agreement that solidifies that balance of power. You have less of that dynamic in the post-crisis, in the sense that it was a tense period, like the Moroccan crisis. There was concern about possibly escalating into a hot conflict, but it didn't. And so the capabilities are still there. So I think Morocco and Germany losing the crisis means they end up having to accept less favorable deals. It would be in that same spirit, but we're still grappling with whether to include it. One being that material difference, has there been a big shift in the balance of power or not? And the second is the smaller numbers. Like you find more of these post-war agreements than you find of these post-crisis agreements, which I think makes sense too with the logic in the sense that post-war there has been a big shift in the balance of power and the victors want to solidify it. The nuclear revolution and weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it's a fascinating question. And I think up until 2020, you might have said, theory of unipolar politics, maybe we don't need to engage in arms races because we have enough to provide our security. I think what's difficult is when you add to that competition nuclear superiority speak and attempts to develop capabilities that may undermine the stability of that nuclear stalemate. So I think the US building ballistic missile defense capabilities undermines confidence in the stability of the nuclear stalemate, which is one big incentive for China to have hypersonic weapons that would evade these capabilities. But it does raise a bigger question that here we're just relying on standard data sets of military capabilities that may not have as much nuance in terms of new technologies. So we'll have to see if we can have a finer grained approach to these measures. Yeah.
Anna.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Anna Pearl. I'm also a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. And I research arms control for emerging technologies. So this is great. I have a clarifying question first. In your data set, do you include IHL, specifically IHL that limits the means of war, like Article 36 of the Geneva Convention or other such treaties? And then I wanted to ask about the implications for including China in arms control. So I always kind of had the impression that arms control is a very like Western-centric concept. And so new ideas about how to include China could also include how do we understand arms control education more broadly? Like how do we translate the benefits that we see coming from arms control to include other actors and make it palatable for them, so to say? Or do we need a new, like more creative approach to arms control than what we have seen historically? So kind of, yeah, what is like the future outlook for your research in that regard?
Interesting. Well, on arms control and education, David Logan has a very interesting piece on whether they read shelling in Beijing. So that's one way to think about the knowledge spreading and the understanding spreading. Previous work too about scientists speaking across the Iron Curtain on possible agreements. I would go back to the example of the US-Soviet Union in the sense that it is hard to come to an agreement in situations where the US has such overwhelming superiority vis-a-vis its adversaries, when at the same time it's speaking at the rate. Union, and there's some attempts in Glassboro for early arms control agreements. And I think just the Soviets weren't ready. I don't know the extent to which the difference is cultural, so much that we're walking the walk and talking the talk and creating this reality over how military capabilities are providing us benefits. And it's hard for other states to agree to a scenario in which they recognize this asymmetry. I think you'll see it in the agreed asymmetric agreements where there's this large shock, and the alternative for the defeated state could be even more destruction. They may say, we have no choice, we need to come to this agreement.
Oh, yeah. To and they do have like some controlling functions, but they're also voluntary. So they're not like arms control agreements per se, but they're like still limiting what states can do in terms of armament.
You said, if I could two-finger, you said, and it has a slide that the laws of armed conflict are not included
Yes.
in this, but Anna's point, or I would say the ban on indiscriminate weapons, which exists in the additional protocol to the Geneva Convention, could be considered an arms control agreement in that light. And
yeah, I mean, it is a difficult issue, and I'd have to go back to see how we coded this one. Some of the cases we encountered that we would sort of code as as laws of war that we wouldn't see as arms control agreement would be sort of no killing of civilian in conflict. Well, that is limiting the use of military capabilities on particular targets, but it's not saying there is a capability that you can't use against any targets. If you have treaties that ban poison, submarines, noxious gases, then we would say you're eliminating their possible use in a conflict, and that for us counts as arms control agreements. But yeah, we should definitely think some more about these. Yeah.
normally I will identify somebody by their shirt or their color, but since there's so many of you who have blue National Defense University shirts, that's going to be really hard today. But the gentleman right here with the blue National Defense University shirt, okay.
Matthew Fuhrmann, NDU student this year, but normally I work in the J5 of the Joint Staff, the Director for Strategy. Gosh, I can't even remember what it's called right now. Strategy. Never mind. My question is, did you think about, I mean, in your research, if it wasn't covered in your research, what are your thoughts on it, of the durability of some of these agreements? Like, you went and your research was focused on the conditions that are present to establish an agreement, but what about sort of the breakdown? Like, what are the conditions when an agreement breaks down, like Versailles Treaty or ABM Treaty? And then the second question I have is about you. So you talked about the three-body problem, but have you thought about, or then you look at like the 4, 5, 6-body problem? And I'm thinking about like the strategic stability in South Asia. We've got China trying to reach parity with the United States, which drives India to try to reach parity with China in nuclear weapons, which drives Pakistan. So that thought.
Great. On the first question, so strictly speaking, we have not coded the durability of agreements, or I can put a plug for a grad student of mine who is thinking about the end of rivalries, and she's specifically looking at whether agreements lead to future agreements and lead to improvement in relations or not. It's very important. We've been at this data set for close to 2 years, and I think we can nail that one. But in terms of arriving at an agreement, but definitely moving forward, thinking of conditions for durability would be very interesting. Here, in terms of the complexity, the 3-body problem, the 4, 5, 6-body problem, I mean, one thing I would say just for consideration, and I don't know that we figured out how to think about it, we're interested in agreements between great powers and the complexity of preferences and rivalries between great powers. Thinking about US-China and the possibility of an agreement between them, potentially including Russia. In the process of collecting that information, we're also seeing regional agreements. So for example, the Pacts of May between Argentina and Chile, where they agreed to limit their naval military capabilities. Now, when you go regional, it opens up more levers that are quite interesting. And in that particular case, it was the presence of the UK as a lender to both and a willing member to sort of enforce an agreement between the two of them, which may not be present once you look at the major arms control or agreements between major powers. But I would say then, I guess the easiest and cleanest scenario to be thinking of the 4, 5, 6-body problem would be regional powers excluding any major power, or maybe even if it is including a major power, thinking about other major powers being willing to enforce these agreements or not. But those, I think, are extra dimensions in addition to the ones we're looking at, and that you have like non-parties to the agreement potentially being willing to assist the parties of the agreement. And so I think that would definitely complexify the problem.
Before I turn to Jim Fuhrmann next, I want to read one from online. Rather than waiting for China to catch up with the United States and its nuclear capabilities, making arms control more likely in your model, couldn't you argue that states that group sets of strategic capabilities together for overall capability, even though they may be different, could reach agreements? That is, in this case, China overmatches the US in theater ballistic missiles, and is overmatched by the United States in the number of long-range nuclear weapons. Are there examples from the past of states bundling in that way? And what are your thoughts about China in that respect?
Well, you see some negotiations in the early 20th century in Europe looking at either naval agreements or land power agreements, and difficulties at that moment in that Britain relies on its naval power and sees it as essential for its survival, and relies less on land power, military capabilities, and wants to use those to limit the power of its potential adversaries. And so I think once you see these, it's a recipe for making it difficult to come up with an agreement. I think it's an interesting consideration, but it does add to the complexity. And I guess when we look at the aggregate capabilities, it is not doing full justice to the differences in potential capabilities. But that would be something to think about.
Okay, Jim Fuhrmann, and then you will be next. Yes.
Jim Fuhrmann of FSI and political science. Really interesting, and I think this is great, and you should take it forward. One conceptual question about tacit versus explicit arms control, and a second one about your main graph there.
Yeah.
So say you and I are countries and we're just arming up, and then we reach a point where we each realize that it makes more sense just to stop, because if we keep going, the other one will keep going, but we don't write it down.
Yes.
In any kind of treaty. What is different for you about, like, what's the difference, or like why do we actually care that much, or should those cases be in here too? And then on the empirics, the graphs you had that show a difference between kind of pre-45 and post-45. I didn't totally get the Hamming thing, but have you looked at, so right now it looks like what you're showing is kind of a correlation where you have this matrix-based measure and that maps on. Two questions there. Have you actually like looked to see whether the mechanism you have in mind about that you're describing like is showing up in the cases? Could that picture just have a lot to do with multipolarity versus bipolarity? Simplifying things, as it were, post, and then, post World War II, there's all kind, if you put a graph up of like the number of international organizations, it just starts, it's like exponential after World War II. Is there like a thing about arms control agreements that's happening post World War II?
Those are great questions. Tacit versus explicit. I think the biggest challenge there might be detecting them and including them in the data set, and that the explicit one at least has the benefit of having the parties writing something down, and we can code the clauses as saying, okay, what does it limit?
But what if, like, any time you have two countries that aren't arming more, that's an arms control agreement?
I mean, that could be produced by lack of competition between those two states, or heavy competition, but conclusion that if they broke out, the other side could respond and enforce an agreement. I see your theoretical point. I think it would be hard for us to catch them empirically, but we can think about it some more. On the mechanisms, we're in the early stages of doing the case studies. I think we see the superiority speak and the intent to wait in the Cold War case, in the intent to wait until there's more parity in the capabilities in the Soviet-US relation. So even in a bipolar world, there is variation over time. which has more to do with capabilities than with preferences in that particular case. There's also, for example, there's negotiations between France and the UK in the 19th century, where the UK would have been content to limit naval arms construction, thinking that if France broke out from the agreement, it would be detected by the UK and they could respond in time. So this idea of whether we have enough capabilities, we can respond in time is there, and this sort of concern for some symmetry and comparability in the capabilities seems to be present in quite a few of the cases, but we'll do some more. And on, yeah, we need to think some more about the INGOs.
Please.
Thank you for your time. My name is Fiona Saunders. I'm a National Defense University student, also a private sector fellow from IBM. My question is about how you came to whether or not, I guess really your definition of arms control.
Yes.
And what I mean is, I think about Russia specifically. It's not really a case with China, whereas Russia has been on a war production footing for really since they moved into Crimea, and it is getting to the point that war production is stabilized, it has stabilized, and is really the driver of their economy. And I think about their desire, at least historically, to sell arms to the point that they're producing and developing arms to sell, to support their economy, as opposed to potentially for, or maybe as well as for military capabilities. And I was just wondering about whether or not there had been any economic analysis on, it didn't appear to be, but it just seemed to me that was potentially could be driving some of the decision-making in the production in Russia to really keep their economy going.
So meaning there's an economic benefit in producing these capabilities and
Yes.
selling them.
As opposed to having them specifically for military capability.
Yeah, I mean, you have similar discussions on the nuclear side when nuclear powers are competing with each other for contracts with potential recipients and eventually agreeing to a limit on with the nuclear suppliers group on the trade of these technologies. So I don't know of any specific studies on what you're interested in. I mean, you know, there's there's detailed case studies of, say, the AQCon network, but specifically on what you're interested in.
Yeah, no, it just seemed to me that might influence how Russia could or be willing to come to an arms control agreement, because economically it might be to their detriment.
Right, yeah. Fahd.
Hi, my name's Fahd. I'm also a Stanton Fellow here this year. Thank you, Alex. This was really great. So one question that I have is just out of curiosity. I wonder, in your data set, do you have examples of perhaps not just a rising power that's trying to catch up in terms of capabilities, a declining power that is declining and then decides to sort of try and lock in a favorable agreement with a rival state before it gets even. The second question is this sort of normative, I think, implication that China, if China catches up sufficiently, then we might see, an greater likelihood of arms control between the two. And I just wonder how tough a sell you think that would be for the national security establishment here, which might see the possibility of a modernizing China trying to sort of catch up with the United States as, in fact, being destabilizing.
Right. So just the second question is how it would be hard for the U.S. national security establishment to agree to come to an agreement with China.
No, for this sort of for them to sort of, I guess, buy this implication or see this as being something that's actually not risky.
Okay. On the declining states locking up the balance of power, well, I see any post-war agreed asymmetric agreement in that light. So France and Britain defeat Germany. Germany has just suffered an adverse shock on its military capabilities, but its economy will be recovering. If there's no agreement on deployment or total armament, they will be rising in the future. So the victors are potentially declining, and they want to lock in an existing balance of power. I mean, similarly, when you look at US-Soviet relations, I mean, the Soviets were just not interested until they felt like they had enough capabilities that they were willing to come to an agreement. So if I understand your second question, you're saying, would the national security establishment buy a conclusion like this one, which is, well, I think no one is optimistic about arms control agreements. So I think this might be the most optimistic I can be in saying there might be some prospects for it. Maybe you won't convince China to limit its capabilities, but after they get to some point, they might see the benefit of limiting total spending, and then they may come to the table. I think, I mean, what we're hearing from the Trump administration is like, I want a deal. We could destroy the world multiple times over. We should come to a deal. So I think, and I think there's a lot of ambition to make history and leave their mark on history in however ways they find advantageous. So some agreement would be one box to check on that front. So I could see some interest within the administration.
Ori.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, I'm Ori. I'm a visiting associate professor here. I thought it was a great talk. Following up on Jim's question, did you come across the database? Did you come across incidents where agreements were initially secret and then they were disclosed? And you have to deal with the issue. So obviously, if they're completely secret, you wouldn't be able to come across them, but maybe some of them were partially secret or completely secret and then disclosed. And how did you have to handle it? How did you handle it? And I was curious by the Israel-Jordan peace treaty. Did you include other peace treaties? Yes. The Camp David peace treaty or anything else? So, like, how would you separate other peace treaties from that specific treaty? And final note, your talk reminded me of what was a secret understanding between Israeli Prime Minister Shamir and Jordanian King Hussein from January 91, just days before the Gulf War broke out. And it was published after, and according to what was published, these two basically agreed something similar to what you say, that Jordan wouldn't allow the Iraqis to use it to launch an attack in Israel, and Israel wouldn't use Jordanian airspace. So maybe you can consider that too.
Great. I did not know about this secret agreement, so we'll have to think about those. But yes, so one of the big phases in this data collection effort was to go through other neutrality agreements. The Egypt-Israel one came up earlier because there are explicit limits on Egypt's deployment of capabilities on its territory. So for that reason, we picked it up sooner. But when we reflected on the definition and thought maybe limiting the use of your territory for deployment by third parties for attacks against that state, the Israel-Jordan came up, but we tried to be as systematic as we could. And it's actually a large number, a significant number of that total of close to 300. There's some, like in the early 20th century, I think it's the Taft-Katsura agreement. You had US diplomats going in Northeast Asia and trying to come with agreements, secret agreements between local officials. And they were picked up in some data sets. But if I remember, it's not that they were secret and then became public. It's that I don't think they fit our definition of limiting military capabilities. And so we have them as excluded agreement. They're not in the list and they're not a part of that analysis. But when we picked it up, we saved that information and set it aside.
Someone in the blue shirt here?
Hi, thank you. Yes, Adam Olson with NDU. Normally, when I'm not in school, a colonel with the U.S. Air Force JAG Corps. Want to talk a little bit or see what your research showed
If
you
you
about
can wait for the mic so the people online can hear you.
geez.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to mention or see what your research showed you about rule of law. when it comes to compliance. I know this woman here, this nice woman, spoke briefly about you know, cultural differences, but China's showing over and over again that they don't have any interest in complying with international norms like UNCLOS and then the WTO. And so, like, what assurances has history showed us about countries actually complying with these? I know we talked about them disintegrating, but what about compliance out the gate? And then also, what makes us think that China cares about signing an agreement, or would they just use this as a subterfuge to catch up even further or surpass the United States in nuclear capability?
Well, I think they will want to catch up, and they wouldn't be interested in speaking other than on issues like information sharing, potentially, if they think that helps reducing the risk of miscalculation, but isn't really limiting the capabilities that they would be building. So I think that is dynamic here, and you have the trust but verify dimension of any agreement. And that's why we think you'd have to have some similarity in capabilities so that the parties feel somewhat confident that if the other side breaks out and try to gain an advantage, they can catch it in time. I mean, I've thought when I was here in this in my first visit to CSAC and thinking about nuclear proliferation, I saw that as an important dynamic of that interaction, is that trying to get nuclear weapons is a costly investment with delayed returns. You would need to have a nuclear program and spend all these resources and efforts before you acquire them. And the key issue is whether the international community can catch that attempt in time and react before it's too late and before the target acquires nuclear weapons. And I think we see that in arms control agreements too, this concern, like, would I be able to catch this attempt to break out? And I think there is a benefit in writing down on paper what it is that we agree to do and not to do, in crystallizing the meaning of certain actions that are taken or not taken if they go against what the parties have agreed to do or agreed not to do. I think it may make it easier for the international community to then rally around that particular party being after aggressive aims that may be dangerous and perhaps should be reacted to before it is too late. And I think, I mean, that is going back to the nuclear side, a dimension with the IEA, for example, before Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, certifying that Iran was complying with the terms of the agreements. And so then what we have with Trump pulling out of that agreement is complicating the possibility of a future or current agreement, again, between the US and Iran. We were talking about the non-credibility of assurances. Now you have Iran wondering, can they trust an agreement with this more powerful state? But again, it brings back to this issue that if you're vulnerable relative to the other state, you may not be willing to come to this agreement because you worry that the other side could just get away with taking advantage. And so that's why, in the context of arms control and arms races, maybe you'll be able to get to an agreement if both sides feel like they would be able to react if one of them decides to break from their obligations.
Let me do a follow-on that connects questions about compliance with some of the questions about duration. And this is a gross generalization, but I wonder whether you find it in other cases. You think about some agreements, states join them without an intent to truly follow them. There's this whole literature about human rights treaties, for example, and why some human rights abusers will sign them. In this area, the Soviet Union and China signed and ratified the additional protocols of the Geneva Conventions without any reservations, while the US signed, issued some reservations about particular clauses it didn't like, and eventually did not ratify. The UK ratified, but with some set of reservations. So it's a different kind of compliance because there's a different scope about it. And when it comes, this is like, I'm echoing Rose Gadamuller, who's made this point a number of times, is that when the Russians don't like an aspect of an arms control agreement
Hmm.
that they had signed, they cheat. And then impose costs on the US for trying to get our allies to say, should we respond or how do we do that? While the United States, like Russia, sometimes signs an agreement, says it's no longer in its interests, and then it withdraws from the treaty, following the rules. Does the history here, well, certainly your data set could help you get at
Yes.
these kinds of questions in really interesting ways. Maybe that's a follow-on study, but would it be worthy to do that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, because I think part of the logic and the benefit of coming to these agreements, especially doing it explicitly, would be clarifying deviations and actions that are inconsistent with the pledges that states have made. And it would be a follow-on because we haven't tracked state behaviors and whether they've complied or not complied. And that would be a difficult data collection effort because some of the non-compliance may be less observable or observable with delay. But I think it would be interesting, and again, raise these questions about crystallizing the mind on the violations that are being perpetrated.
Yeah. One last question from online then. I like your historical approach here, but you didn't address the question about opportunistic aggression. One of the concerns about the China-Russia relationship now is that one state will take advantage of a war with the United States to be opportunistic and aggress in the different theater. Was that a concern in earlier arms control agreements that have multiple parties? And how did they think about dealing with the danger of opportunistic aggression?
Yeah. I mean, I think you see it, I mean, in the Washington and London naval treaties, you want all the parties to be limiting their capabilities. And the states are trying to solve different problems as they come to this agreement. And then you see it too in the negotiations that don't lead to any agreements. In that, again, if you have British-German negotiations over limits on land power, well, Germany feels that's more of a limit on their capabilities than it would be on British capabilities, and so it leads to some agreements not being as expensive as they otherwise could have been. So yeah, no, I think it is a factor on the current context. I guess this is hypothetical, so I won't venture there, but it's yeah, I think it would be something interesting to think about.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Alex for coming here today.